Hello, everybody, and welcome to Radical Friction, the editor author relationship. I am here with Bob Sutton and Tim Bartlett. Bob just wrote a great book, which he's going to tell you about, and Tim is Bob's editor and mine, The Friction Project. Okay, Bob, I know this is a horrible question and I hate it when I get it, but tell me about your book in a minute or less.
Oh, sure. So this is a book that I wrote with my co-conspirator, Hugh Rao, and it's called The Friction Project. And what we got interested in was we worked with all these organizations and had personal experiences where it was difficult or impossible to get things done in organizations. And we heard a lot of people complain about things like I work in a frustration factory and things like that. So not having real jobs like most of the people in your audience were academics. So we spent 7 years, it's really 8 years by now, including doing things like a podcast that you were on, the Friction Podcast. And you were actually our final guest, even. You closed it out. And a whole bunch of other learning adventures. And along the way, we not only uncovered a whole bunch of causes of friction. Maybe my favorite, which we aren't talking about enough, is jargon monoxide, incomprehensible, meaningless language. Yeah. So in fact, that's Tim's job, is to eliminate the jargon monoxide from our books. And then the good news along the way, which I won't dig into in too much time because I want to especially get to what it's like to work with Tim, since that's the main point here, is that we actually ran into a lot of good news, that there's a lot of good things that people can and do to eliminate bad friction. And then there are some things in life that should be difficult or impossible. So that's sort of a summary of the book.
So when I think of your book, tell me if this analogy is helpful or terrible and you never want to hear it again. I think of, there's some friction that causes you to have a blister, and that's bad friction. And then there's other friction that creates a pearl of great price, and that's good friction. What do you think about that?
I think that's something that we could have put in the first three sentences, except it's too late right now.
Save it for the paperback.
Yes.
Well, save it for the. It is funny that so one of my friends used to work at Apple, and you did too, and he said that Steve Jobs used to tell the same story, when the same stories he's told over and over again was when he was a teenager. One of his neighbors had one of those rock tumblers.
Yes.
And when apparently Jobs told the story like constantly. When all the rocks rubbed together, they all became shiny and beautiful. And that was the kind of culture he wanted to create. And we don't talk that much about constructive conflict in our book, but constructive difficulty does have its advantages.
Absolutely.
So, yes.
Absolutely. So Bob, you and I have known each other for quite a while. The no asshole rule features prominently in Radical Candor. And when you were telling me about this project, I said, you've got to meet Tim because he is the great editor of all time.
Let's embarrass the hell out of him.
So,
let's if we don't get him to blush,
just stop right there.
Yeah,
let's make him blush.
Yeah, I think you're already succeeding, Bob. So
yes,
public praise for Tim.
That's not his style.
I know.
So you want me to start?
You start.
So this is my eighth book, my eighth business book. I've also had a zillion editors for all sorts of short pieces and everything. And as a book editor, Tim is the best book editor I've ever worked with. He also probably made me make the most changes. I think there's a correlation there because he is picky. So I have really appreciated it. And the other thing about Tim, and we can dig into some of the things he's done. I actually started pulling out some parts of chapters that I sent him, and I looked at the change. And it's kind of amazing how much they changed. But the other thing about him, which I think is in addition to his skill as an editor, is that it really does feel like as an author, he's on my side. So it was sort of from the process that he was the one who I talked to. In fact, I talked to you and Safi Bakal first to see, is this guy any good? So we gossiped about you behind your back. And
we had drinks at the Dutch Goose. In fact,
the Dutch Goose. That's right. We had drinks, and we had deviled eggs. But all through the process, I feel like he's been sort of help Huggy and I sort of navigate the book through the whole process. It isn't just like he did the editing and was done. So I've really appreciated that.
Yeah. As I was thinking, now it's my turn, Tim, to give you some public. We will let you talk in a minute,
Yeah,
but first, but one of the things that is so hard about writing is self-loathing. Self-criticism. And sometimes there's so much self-criticism, it becomes self-loathing. And one of the great things about working with a great editor is that I know that you are going to catch the mistakes that I don't catch. You're going to catch the jargon monoxide. And that allows me to shut down that self-critical voice and to write. And so working with you it's very liberating. So thank you for that.
Well, I think that goes both ways. I remember with sending Bob, I think it was the first chapter I edited, and it was very heavy. And I remember we'd kind of gotten to know each other a little bit, just talking about the ideas in the book. And I remember I just wrote, look, you should look at this. It may feel overwhelming. Tell me if it's too much. I can do it differently. I can just say this isn't working, or I can sort of point out why it's not working. And you came back and you said, yeah, it probably is a little too much. I don't know if you remember that, but you, and you said, and you kind of told me what you needed. And I think part of the process for me is figuring out how to work best with people who have a very distinct voice, who know how to write, who have big ideas and basically know how to communicate them. And, figuring out how I can intervene in a way that'll be most effective, and also feel, as you say, like I'm on your side. And with Kim, I think it's in some ways, it's been so long since we started working together, but I think what you're talking about is really important. It's sort of developing trust. And sort of that message I sent to Bob at the beginning was, okay, like, you can trust me. I'm not going to overwhelm you. If this is not going to work for you, then we'll figure out how to make it work. And I think that early part of the process of communicating that is really important. It sort of starts things off on the right note.
Well, so and Kim, I'm curious what you think about this too. So there's this struggle I always have, and by the way, when I was especially an academic editor, I had this as an editor myself, which is, on one hand, I don't want to put asphalt over the person's voice so it sounds like mine. On the other hand, I want to help them be their best self, and there was even at one point that I remember. I sort of said, it was probably a quarter of the way into the book, so where are my chapters? And you said, I edited it, but I'm going back and I'm undoing a bunch of the edits because I think that I took your voice away from you too much. And I've never had, and I won't name the publications, but there are some publications in our field, in particular, when you read them, they all sound exactly the same because they get edited 8 different ways by 8 different people. And one thing that I really do appreciate is that there's that tension, that process, and you'll even let me make little grammatical errors, which I appreciate, even because I like them.
You've earned the right, Bob.
And sort of short sentences, sometimes fragments, and it really works. So yeah, I think that's definitely. And I think that's something you learn. I think you sort of early on as an editor, you just like, okay, I'm just going to show that I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to do as much as I can. And at some point, you figure out, that some things have marginal benefits. Some things unintentionally make things worse, and you try to avoid doing that as much as you can.
Yeah, I'm even looking at some notes from a conversation with you right here. And this is the kind of thing that's really helpful, I think, for any author, which is, you said, try to vary the length of your sentences and of your paragraphs more. It'll help keep the reader going. And that's the kind of thing I think almost any author could that, because I think I probably naturally write the same length sentences and paragraphs, and that was something that's probably why you got some sentence fragments back, by the way, because.
He was taking your advice.
So anyway,
no, I think it really works. I love the way the book reads. So I'm with you. Absolutely.
And the thing that's amazing, I think, to me, Tim, is the way you're able to, I don't think there's a single sentence in either of my books that you didn't change. Like, in fact, that you didn't say something about when my when my kids get their papers back from their teachers and they feel discouraged, I always pull up one of them and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Mom, you're a terrible writer."
Bob, you'll get that on the next book.
Yeah.
I think I got a bit of that in this book. It's
Right.
it's because it was funny because I just
No,
I
I'm
just
kidding.
I'm looking at the way that the first 3 paragraphs of chapter 9 read, and this is, me. I'm a very compulsive writer. What I send it is like the 97th draft, anyways, and almost none of this exists now. I thought this was perfect when I sent it to you, and so I don't. So Kim, do you do this? So when I get back at it, this isn't just from you. I have learned to wait a full day before responding to any editor, because my first reactions are never my best self.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And the other thing that I've learned is sometimes, Tim, you'll change something and I don't like what you wrote, but I do realize that there was something wrong with what I wrote. And the fact that you're willing to rewrite it helps me better identify because if you just highlighted the sentence and said, "This isn't quite right," I wouldn't know what was bugging you. But by seeing your correction and disagreeing with your correction, then I'm able to get to a better place. And that also happens, I think, a fair amount.
Yeah. And I think authors really vary on. There are some authors who take absolutely everything you send, and that makes me really nervous because
Yeah.
I don't always know, right? And
Yeah.
you could sit and try to figure everything out, and you'd never finish. And some authors are so defensive they don't want anything. So I think that's the key. And I always say that at the beginning. If I change something and you don't like it, it means I didn't understand it, and it should show you what I didn't understand. And it's up to you to sort of to then say, okay, this doesn't sound like me, or you've missed the point, or what have you. And I think that's when the process really works. And probably each book we work on, I think that gets better, right? It sort of somehow you get to know the person even better, and so the communication gets easier. But yeah, that's always it's always a big question. The first edits you send, how's the author going to respond? You just don't always know.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
one of the edits that you made, Tim, that was my favorite. And so, Bob, I wonder what your favorite edit from Tim was. But deep into radical candor, I forgot what I was writing about, but something that I find annoying. And I was maybe veering into obnoxious aggression the way that I was writing about this thing. And you wrote in the margin, "Hello, care personally?" question. I was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that part."
I remember that because I was sitting, we were on vacation. I was sitting up early in the morning reading it, and suddenly I was like, this doesn't even sound like him. By then I'd spoken to you a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that happens. It often happens at the end of the book when you're getting tired and you just want to get done.
Yeah.
So that's why you have to read the last chapter as carefully as you read the first.
Yeah.
No doubt.
So you're asking favorite edits. I think of two. One more structural, and one was a darling of mine that Tim killed. One was that the first chapter was too long, and it was we didn't even call it what do we call the opening? Introduction? I don't even know. I got to look at the book to even figure out what we call it. Setting the stage, part 1. So I said like this 30-page chapter, and Tim was no. If you run the reader through a 30-page chapter, they're going to start out exhausted. You don't want this.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really smart thing to cut it into 2 sort of shortest chapters. And then the other thing, and so Tim, you don't know this, but there's this example that I've been in love with since I've been in college, which I tried to sneak in at the end of the last chapter. It's from John Steinbeck's The Log from the Sea of Cortez, and it's about mental provisioning. I have tried to put this in every book I've ever had, and it's never survived. And you crossed it out. And you said the same thing that other editors, including academic article editors, this is really cool, but what does this have to do with your argument? So that was probably my favorite edit, because I maybe now, excuse me, I will finally stop trying, because I was just enamored of it when I was in my 20s, and I've always wanted to sneak it in. And sometimes I use the word mental provisioning randomly, and people have no idea what I'm talking about.
So what does it mean? You can talk about it, right? We're not going to edit you, Bob. What does it mean? I love the idea.
I can read you straight from my deleted introduction.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So these things from the cutting room floor, they prove useful.
A strong point, a strong and shared point of view, so you know what you're doing and why, so you don't fool yourself. I'm quoting Steinbeck now. So you will travel with a more complete picture of what you learned and how to feel along the way. So
it sounds like loud listening, Bob. I love it.
I don't know, but it had nothing to do with the next paragraph. I was just reading the transition, and it really isn't about friction fixing. So anyhow, so that was just because yet once again, and I use it in my essay. I think for a graduate school too. I sort of have a little bit of it's a classic darling that a good editor kills. So that was probably my favorite effort.
Does sound like you should write a piece about that, though. I mean, if you've been carrying it this long, it seems like it must have some meaning that would be interesting.
I think it's just useless emotional baggage, honestly.
I don't know. The mental provisioning, I like it. I think we're going to do a whole other LinkedIn Live on mental provisioning. You don't have to, we can just talk about it. You don't have to write about it. So,
well, it means the same as mindset, I suppose. So we can use so when people get tired of the word mindset, we can use the word mental provisioning, I guess.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's good. Maybe we'll get Carol Dweck on that LinkedIn Live and we'll talk about it. All right. So, Tim, I would love for you to give both Bob and I some radically candid criticism, some public. I know usually we say public criticism is not good, but we're going to make an exception to that rule. We want you to tell us what is frustrating about working with us, because I think writers, maybe, it's really nice of you to put up with our neuroticism. And in fact, to allow me to be my full neurotic self as I write, so that I can write. But I imagine that there's some emotional labor in that for you in that. What do you think? Oh my goodness, a big vulture just landed on my roof as I asked that question.
Symbolism, heavy-handed, but symbolism.
Yes.
I don't know. Because I love you both, it's difficult to do this anyway. But in the spirit of the question, I'll start with you, Kim. I think what I would say about you is that and this is true. I mean, it's always the case that I think the things that are weaknesses are also strengths. It's that you seek a lot of feedback on your work. So so I might be editing, and there'll be someone reading for this facet of the book or this facet of the book, and I think. And I'm of two minds on it, because on the one hand, I think it often really does give you important perspectives, and sometimes I think it stops you from being able to zero in on ultimately what you want to say. So I would say as long as I have the last word, I'm fine with that continuing.
You're the boss of the book for sure.
And in truth, they're again, it's a talented people, and for each of them, I can see the reasoning. So I'll undercut it a little bit. Bob, you and I have just finished, and I'm in the glow of having the book and being on the cusp of publication day. So it really all feels pretty good, to be honest.
Well, you got selective memory, so come on, give it to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's an interesting example. So the cover of this book was quite a journey. It may be one of the longest cover processes I've ever had. There's something that the art department calls a design spiral, where the author doesn't like the original design, maybe comes up with 3 or 4 of his own designs, gets another designer to design the book, and it makes him frustrated. But again, the interesting thing about this process is that the cover we ended up with, I think, and maybe you want to show it to people, I think is so much better than any of the others we had. You can't actually, you couldn't see the little friction at the bottom there, but it took us a long time to get here, and so I don't know what the critique is, but
Well,
Yeah.
I've said this to people since I have been. So there's another person who's worth mentioning here, which is Christy Fletcher, our literary agent, who might be even more picky about covers than I am.
Yes.
She is extremely picky, and so between her and me, we actually hired somebody. This guy Justin Gammon, who did this cover for our last book together, Scaling Up Excellence, which we like not as much, we don't like as much as The Friction. And so we actually hired him before the book at one point was called Out of the Muck. So somewhere I've got 10 covers of a book called Out of the Muck. And I'm endlessly willing to both take forever. And by the way, and this is something that never works for me as a threat with publishers, which is, you're going to have to pay for it. I already have a cover designer almost on retainer. And but one thing I will say, no cover proposal survives without a first contract with the other, Rita McGrath.
Rita is correct.
On the mark.
Except me. When I said for Radical Candor, I said I want an orange and I want a 2x2, and I would say you delivered on both.
And I had loved. There was the Heath Brothers book, Made to Stick, so I gave that to the designer as an example, and somehow it came to that. But yes, I hear you. Christy is and she's also on the mark, right? I mean, she has a pretty good track record with these things. So yeah.
So thank you for putting up with us. I've said this publicly. I couldn't believe you didn't complain more, honestly. In the amazing thing about this cover experience was that when the one came through, we all said that's it. So we argued and argued and argued. I've never seen it was within 10 minutes we all said that's it.
That goes back to the rock tumbler thing that you were talking about, Bob. Like a lot of noise, a lot of friction. We wish it were easier, but it's worth it to go through that process because that's what outcome these beautiful book covers.
Well, I'll tell you a contrary story since I, what are they going to do to me? So this cover.
Oh yeah.
So this cover, the story of this cover, I wish I had it. So I paid an absolute fortune. I found the most expensive designer in Silicon Valley to
that's saying something.
Well, it's Susan Kerr. Susan Kerr was on the original design team of the Macintosh. Like she did the bomb and the garbage can. I found her, and she came up with this beautiful cover. And I'll send it to people later. I sort of like and they said they couldn't fit it on the cover. And I paid so much money for that cover, and she was so mad. And I asked her if she wanted credit for this because they did chairs. And the exact quote was, "I refuse to take credit for that piece of shit." So that one, and it's not terrible, but
the other one was beautiful. I have it somewhere in my email. It really was much better.
It was so much. So
I've never heard this story.
So thank you, Tim. So I was waiting for the Susan Kerr story that happy, and you just kept putting up with Christy and Huggy and me saying, no, that's not it. No, that's not it. So I mean, at some point I should do like a LinkedIn post that shows just 10 of the covers to show the journey because it was remarkable.
I love that. Patty, thank you for and you'll find Radical Respect is also purple and orange. So the cover, I loved the cover of Just Work. I just didn't love the title. So we changed it and we radically rewrote that book. All right. So Tim and Bob, I have a question for you. I would love for you all to just explore some of the friction between idea and implementation for the book on friction, just to get a little bit meta here.
Well, so the one part about the friction, so this book did take like 7 or 8 years in the making, but the one part which was before we got it to Tim, which I think is important, and for those of you who have different literary agents, so our literary agent, some literary agents, you have the sense that they're just trying to maximize the amount, but with Christy, and there's especially a woman named Sari Fuentes who now works for Christy's operation, which is now part of United Talent Agencies, but it used to be Fletcher and Company. So we spent maybe 5 years really doing the research for the book, and then a year really writing proposals. And Sarah and Christy would not let us submit a proposal until it met their standards. And Sarah she was So Tim, I think she was maybe tougher than you were. And the other thing about her is the way you edit is you do some rewriting of sentences. She would just say, this doesn't make any sense because it's blah, blah, blah. And we'd have to figure it out. So she was great. And the other part of the journey, and Tim was involved in some of the tail end of this, there was a point for about 6 months, and this came out of a brainstorming session between Adam Grant and me about titles, where we both were absolutely determined it should be called The Shit Fixers. It was like, so I've got like 6 months of the
you
book
authors
called,
and your profanity. It's
well, you know, the word asshole's been very good to me, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep. Shit is not a word you should use in the Amazon won't let you advertise against shit. You can advertise against ass, but not shit.
In those days.
So in terms of the friction, although the year or so of revision was tough, and we did delay publication date by 6 months because it was such an aggressive deadline. At least I couldn't figure out how to meet it. So that would also be part of the friction too. And you were so nice about it too. So I really appreciated that.
Good. I was just thinking actually, when you're talking about the hard work your proposal underwent, I think that must have been the same case with the original proposal for Radical Candor back in 2016, 15. I can't remember what year it was.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote the whole book, actually. I couldn't write a proposal, and I wasn't even going to try to publish the book. I thought I had just written it for the people I was coaching until somebody set me straight. And Howard Yoon, my agent, wrote the proposal because I don't really have like a marketing brain. And, you know, they wanted me to say who's the target audience. And I'm like, you tell me. I don't know. I just wrote the book.
Howard did you right?
Yeah, Howard wrote a great proposal. I couldn't do it. I don't know. My brain just doesn't work that way.
Well, for members of the audience,
in both of your case. So go ahead.
Just going to say an information point for members of the audiences, because I always have to have these conversations with first-time authors, which is to say, if you're writing a trade, especially nonfiction book, they buy the proposal, not the book. So the proposal is very important.
Yes,
so that's all I was going to say. Go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Tim.
No, I was just going to say, and this is not an answer to your question again, but in both of your cases, and you probably don't know this about each other, but I preempted the book. You know, I bought it before other publishers could offer, and I think in both cases it was because you had been put through your paces. You know, I felt the ideas felt really fully formed, and so really we could focus on things like titles and obsess about them. And in Kim's case, Radical Candor did come with a different title. I don't even remember what it was, but
it for a while I was calling it Cruel Empathy. And funny thing about Cruel Empathy, I was sold on. I thought that was the name of the book, and my husband hated it, but I was ignoring his feedback. And then one of the people I was coaching was Jack Dorsey, and he refused. He said, "I will not read a book called Cruel Empathy. It sounds like a Harlequin romance." And I was like, "Okay." I should have listened to my husband in the first place, but and then we named it. We I think by the time it got to you, it was like Give a Damn or something like that, and it got named by Dan Pink in an elevator ride. Was how I
love that story.
Yeah, how that name. So that was some good friction. Like I had to get some feedback, some strong feedback from a lot of different people. So
go
ahead, Tim.
No, go.
So I got another question for both of you. Like, explain for folks, because we often, and I imagine, Bob, you get a lot of these questions from people interested in writing books, and I think they would be interested in understanding a little bit more about the process that you two went through, and Tim, you and I can describe it as well, to figure out what you need from each other.
Well, so I sort of back up. So with Tim and Huggy was very much involved in idea development, but for better or worse, I'm so compulsive that it in terms of the actual drafting, it was mostly, or probably 90% Tim and I going back and forth, to be honest, in terms of sentences and paragraphs. And this is my wife. I think it's the first book my wife Marina actually read. I'm not sure. Not sure. Maybe she read the No House Rule, but I'm not sure she's ever read my other books. But she actually read this one, and she was an English major, a CEO, and a lawyer, so she's a good person to read it. So she did find things, but it was mostly me and Tim. And then there's other authors I know who have all these different processes. So I'm actually curious. I mean, what other processes? Like, what do you have other people like who help you write? Like, some people have committees they write the book with, basically. So I'm just curious about other, because I just because I have my process that works, and I just love going over one sentence after another, and just one editor is almost all I can take. But there's some people who do it with, like, they have like a committee almost. Adam Grant kind of has a committee that reads every paragraph of his and gives him a grade.
Yeah, no, I don't get grades, but I do solicit, as Tim said earlier, a ton of feedback. So my process is that I try to turn off my self-critical, self-judging part of my brain, and I just basically vomit on the page. I write and write and write and write. I write really, really, really fast. And then I ask a lot of people to read it. So I think Radical Candor had 100 collaborators, 100 and some odd, over 100 collaborators on the document. That's what Tim was talking about. He's like, oh my God, there's all these comments. 100. And same thing with Radical Respect. Over 100 people read it and edited or just made comments. And, you know, I maybe believe to a fault, as Tim said, in soliciting feedback. But for me, like, the second hardest thing about writing is getting inside my brain. And that's why I have to turn off. And then, but the very hardest thing is getting back out. And for that, I need the perspective of a lot of other people to get back out of my brain.
What? And I think Radical Respect also, because of its subject matter,
needed.
You really wanted to have multiple. You really needed multiple perspectives. Yeah. You know, there were inevitably going to be gaps in your experience, and that, I think, was crucial, and some real heroes, I think, in that part of the process. Breeze Harper and others, I think, really improved the book.
Your brother also helped.
My brother, my friend Zach.
Yes.
No, really, and in each case sort of had a perspective that we thought would be valuable, and I think in each case made a contribution. So and yeah, in answer to your original question, I always have a conversation right at the beginning of the process. And Bob and I and Huggy had this where we just talk about, you know, literally right after signing the contract, how it's going to work. And usually I try to sort of say, let me see a couple of chapters right away and give you some macro feedback, and just make sure that there's sort of global things that can be incorporated as you go, so that we can focus in on more important things down the line. And I think we did that, Bob. I think we ended up. I read some early chapters.
I think that was very helpful. I'm thinking about this, bringing other people into the process a little bit more, because I think that I overly portrayed Kim as like having 100, and it just be me and you. A big exception here is, and in some ways, I shouldn't say this, 3 days before the book comes out, but I almost wish I'd done this more in the process. But when I'd write about, when I would draw on like a published case, or a case actually that Huggy and I did, or my own research, or something's in the media, I wouldn't go back and forth. But if it was somebody who I was writing about and quoting them, who I knew, I would go back and forth with them. So to give you two examples, one, there's a guy named Carl Liebert, who we wrote about when he was head of supply chain at Home Depot. He's had many executive jobs. I went back and forth with him quite a bit. And then the final 3 or so paragraphs of the book quote a woman named Clara Shai. Clara is now CEO of AI of Salesforce. I've known her since she was an undergraduate, but she wrote a best-selling book before she was 30 that talked about the commercial effects of Facebook and other social media. She can write. So she and I went back on maybe 8 iterations, because I was quoting her, and we did it on like texts, like on phones. I think she was using a phone and I was using the text on my thing. So that was probably 8 iterations, because I was sort of quoting something that she said in conversation she taught in my class, and I didn't want to misquote her. So literally the last 3 paragraphs or so of the book with Clara Shai are co-authored by the two of us. So, and she knows my work really, really well, and we know each other really well. And boy, was she a good writer. She's an unusually good writer for a CEO. So,
Yeah.
so that would be
Yeah,
an
that's the
example of
thing.
a
If you
little
find the
fibbing.
right person. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I think that that writing, no matter, and editing, these are both labors of love. You know, you do it almost because you can't not do it. So like if I don't write, I get agitated, I get a little depressed, like it's something I have to do, like exercise or eating or something. And so what I would love for both of you to talk about, like, what are some of the joys? Like, why do we do this? What are some of the joys, and why is it so painful? Because it's both.
Tim, you go first.
Yeah. So, what are the joys, and why is it so painful? So I think the joys are in on my side of it are in working with people who have really big ideas and important ideas that have power, and being able to help them unleash the power of those ideas. And there's a lot of satisfaction in that when it works, and a lot of sadness and frustration when it doesn't work, and it doesn't always work. What was the second part? The
joys, and like, why is it so painful? Because sometimes it really does feel like a form of torture. Like, why are we doing this to ourselves?
I think it's torture when we're circling around an idea, but we just can't seem to pin it down. And so that's where I think the editor's job is just to ask questions, right? Just like, is this what you mean? Is this what you mean?
Yeah.
What about this? But yes, I think there, inevitably there's some parts of the argument you're making that that aren't as clear to you, and yet they're important to making your case. So I think that's part of it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's very well said. I mean, I would describe it, the pain anyway, almost like it's clear in the abstract in my brain, or it feels clear to me what I want to say. And then every time I put the words down, they're wrong. And I'm like, what? Why can I not say that? Like, why is it so hard for me to say this? And it's I remember when I was learning to speak, I wanted a watermelon. And I didn't know the word for watermelon. And I was at some neighbor's house, and I was like trying to explain to them what I wanted. And it was so clear in my mind. I was like, the red thing with the black things and the green. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I vividly remember that, like, it's one of my earliest memories. And sometimes that's what writing feels like. It's like that water that is so clear in my brain, and yet it was not. I could not make it clear to anyone else.
So I think that's a beautiful description. And there are different people who think in different ways. So I don't want to diss people, but there have been in my life many times when I could teach a class or give a speech where I could make the audience laugh and it worked and everything. And then I went to write it down, and the logic just completely dissolved on the page in front of me. And there is, and by the way, just, as a professor, I guess I've gotten away with this for 40 years or something, is talking about stuff that I haven't written about. But there's something about when I go through the writing process that I feel like I understand the logic and the way it fits together really well. And in corporate America, you can sort of see two different cultures, and now they're starting to merge, which is there's the PowerPoint, sort of Microsoft sort of culture, where everything was PowerPoint. And then there's the Amazon culture where they all write and read little memos before meetings. And it's interesting because Microsoft, even though they're from PowerPoint, they've hired enough Amazon executives that the writing culture is starting to invade Microsoft, the Amazon writing culture. So they're becoming merged a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you've been a real corporate executive. I haven't, but I've been hearing from a lot of my friends that, I work at Microsoft, but my boss makes me write a memo before the meeting. I think there's something to that.
Famous 6-page memos. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and the you really do see the flaws. Notice this. I'm going to wave a purple flag on myself. You really do notice the flaws in your thinking when you write sentence after sentence after sentence, whereas you can kind of hand wave through a PowerPoint or a keynote and not make any sense, and everybody's nodding along because you're saying it with great confidence or something. And it's harder to write with that kind of, it's harder to bloviate in writing than it is when you're talking with a PowerPoint slide behind you.
Yeah, and it's harder to do this in an academic audiences. They're harder to fool. But I hate to say it, but with executives, audiences, and students, when things are falling apart, I know to tell a good story or a joke to distract them from the fact that I'm not making any sense. That does not work on the page.
No, it does not. It does not. So, Tim, there's a question from the audience. How many books do you work on simultaneously? And I'm also curious to know the answer to this question.
Yeah, it really varies. There's certain times of year when people finish projects sort of December and sometimes right before the summer, sometimes right at the end of the summer. So it can be, it can be as many as 3 or 4. But that doesn't really work for me. So I try really hard not to be doing too many, 1 or 2 at most, editing anyway, at one time. And sometimes, as I said, like there's a stage of the process where I'm reading a chapter and just giving very global feedback. I'm not editing on the page, and that I will do often. Like Friday, sort of an editing day. So if I have one of those things due as a sort of forcing function, I'll make a date with the author to go over it, and I'll spend 2 hours in the morning on Thursday just going through the chapter. So that stuff's always going on. There's always someone with a chapter that needs reading, and lately I have a really good person working with me, a guy named Kevin, who Bob knows. And
love Kevin. We both.
Well.
Let's give a little public praise to Kevin.
Kevin is he's like the navigator through the there's so many handoffs in the publishing system. He's so good.
Yeah, he makes sure we never get
dropped. And he's also really smart. He's like a really smart editor. So I've taken to having him join me on the Friday calls, and that's been really fun too, just to have early on I would sort of get together before just to make sure we coordinated, but I've gotten to the point where I just trust him to have interesting things to say, and I'm learning. I'm sometimes thinking, I wish I had caught that. So, but yeah, it's usually one full book and then parts of others of varying numbers depending on what people have handed in.
I have a follow-up question to that, because one thing that's different about you, and at least that Chris, you said to me about you that I might like you, is that there's a lot of people who do almost all pure business books, and you seem to do a broader range. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the range you do and what you learn from sort of cross-pollinating the different styles.
Yeah, that's I think definitely how I think of myself, and actually it was the success of a book called Radical Candor that kind of made me a business book editor.
I didn't know that.
So he doesn't really love business books.
I've come to love them, and I've come to love them because the really good ones are they're about human behavior in some way or another, and about the ways we mess things up and how to sort them out. But yeah, I mean, I do a pretty broad random list, and this month I have a Lost Holocaust memoir that's just come out.
I just bought that. I'm going to read it this weekend.
Yeah, got a really great review this week in the Times. It's called Cold Crematorium, and yeah, I think that I like the variety. I like to learn about different things, and both of you are storytellers, and that's in some ways the parts of the book I enjoy the most. And sometimes I really like narrative nonfiction, which is essentially telling a story from beginning to end. So I like that part of it too, and just the variety.
So we've got about 1 minute left. I think we should end with an homage to our readers, why we love our readers. And maybe we can drop a link to your book, Bob, so that you can have more people to love who are going to read your book.
I love my readers because they keep me honest. So that's what I'll just say that.
Yeah, I would say the thing that really just makes me happy over and over and over again, and the reason I write is someone will send me a note, and they'll say, your book really helped me in this moment. And one person said to me, this was like one of the most meaningful moments of my whole life. This person said, I became a manager for the first time and I felt really lonely. And then I read your book and I felt less alone. And that is why I read and also why I write. It's a way to kind of reach out, connect across time and space, even if we've never actually met the person.
That's beautiful. I love that.
All right. Well, thanks everyone who joined.
Thanks, everyone.
There's one last.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, one last question. Somebody's listening to Radical Candor on Spotify, so thank you for listening. And thanks to both of you. It's such a pleasure to collaborate. And everybody, go out and buy a copy of The Friction Project, and you will know the difference between the kind of friction that's going to give you a blister and give you a pearl of great price.
Ooh, so, Kim, right. you should have a radio show. You are awesome at this. I've talked to you like 100 times. I've never talked to you in this situation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.